Okay, and now it's time for our weekend recap. We're going to start it off with Jarrett Hurd versus Francisco Santana. A very curious performance when you factor in the circumstances that this was not the Jarrett Hurd of old. I think that needs to be addressed, and I think that needs to be understood. That Jarrett Hurd wasn't consistent with what he's become known for. That Jarrett Hurd is known as a physically imposing pressure fighter in the junior middleweight division, but that's not the Jarrett Hurd that we got against Francisco Santana. This was a Jarrett Hurd that very much appeared to be working on things from the opening bell, things that he's not normally associated with. You know, Jarrett Hurd started off this fight sticking and moving, showing the jab, but when he showed it, it wasn't a key to get in, rather a deterrent to keep Francisco Santana out. It very much appeared that Jarrett Hurd was attempting to maintain distance and spacing, fighting on the go, fighting off the back foot, and
moving around the ring,
trying to become more than what he was before, which characteristically was a pressure fighter. But Jarrett Hurd was not your characteristic pressure fighter in this fight. In this fight against Francisco Santana, who, at least for the last 2 years, has been campaigning as a welterweight. I think it needs to be addressed that Francisco has prior experience to campaigning as a junior middleweight. It's just that ahead of this fight, for the last 2 years, this guy has been campaigning as a welterweight. This is a guy who's lost one to anyone from Saddam Ali to Jose Benavidez.
At welterweight.
To Jermell Charlo in 2011.
At junior middleweight.
He actually drew with Julian Williams the fight before that, before Julian Williams took his first professional loss at the hands of Jermell Charlo. And this is what I mean, that Francisco Santana had prior experience to campaigning as a junior middleweight. It's just that ahead of this fight, well, Francisco was coming up in weight because he was campaigning as a welterweight, not a junior middleweight. So it's a very curious situation to try and assess, because you tell yourself that Jarrett Hurd is levels above a guy like Francisco Santana. You tell yourself that this should be a walk in the park for Jarrett Hurd, that he should be able to dispatch this guy handily. But he goes out there, and the fight actually goes to the cards. You're not expecting it to go to the cards. But if it did, I think it has a lot to do with, one, Jarrett Hurd experimenting with a new base style, that this is not the Jarrett Hurd that's looking to key his way in with the jab, get mid-range to inside, and pressure a guy, that this is not the Jarrett Hurd we're dealing with anymore, and that, you know, Francisco Santana, he actually has experience at this weight. Yeah, he's racked up a couple of losses, but the guy's been here before, and he's been here with some people. So when I think about the performance, I think that Jarrett Hurd has looked better. I mean, it was a lackluster showing as far as lackluster showings go, but it's a lackluster showing based on a deliberate attempt to distance Jarrett Hurd from the fighter, the kind of fighter that he used to be. I understand that some people might have been expecting more from Jarrett Hurd. That you expect a guy, a former unified champion with such physically imposing size and punching power, a guy who dropped Erislandy Lara, you understand, a guy who put to sleep Tony Harrison. You expect a guy like this to be able to dispatch the likes of a Francisco Santana, because this guy's not a major player at any weight that he fights in, whether it's 147 or 154. I understand that those expectations are there. I get that. But I also get that Francisco Santana hasn't actually been stopped by anyone since 2009, when he fought Kareem Mayfield for the second time. Since then, you know, Francisco's taken losses to Jermell Charlo and Saddam Ali and Jose Benavidez. He drew with Julian Williams, and these are some notariable names. And what you notice is these notariable names didn't stop Francisco Santana. So I think that counts for something. I think that needs to be addressed, that this is a guy who's been in there with a lot of familiar faces, but they didn't stop him.
They didn't.
So if you're trying to be fair and assess the performance and the fight's aesthetic overall, that has to be factored into it. And just as well, it has to be factored into it that Jarrett Hurd wasn't the characteristic Jarrett Hurd that goes out there looking to stop a guy. He does appear to be experimenting with a new base style, and because it's in the experimental stages,
there's wrinkles.
It all hasn't quite come together for Jarrett Hurd yet. I watched this fight, and I got the sense that if the Jarrett Hurd of old would have showed up, this fight would have finished much sooner. But Jarrett himself is distancing himself from the kind of things that he used to do and the way he went about a fight. So it was lackluster. I don't disagree with those out there who feel that it was a lackluster showing, that it was a bit ho-hum and you expect more. I'm just saying that the rhyme and the reason for that is because Jarrett Hurd is experimenting with a new base style against a very experienced guy. And I don't know how much success Jarrett is going to have with this. I don't know how long it's going to take him for it to all come together as a complete package. I'll say that I don't fault Jarrett Hurd for experimenting with a new base style and trying to add more to his repertoire on the heels of that loss to Julian Williams. I mean, it makes sense that, what you were doing before was working for you up until it didn't work. So now it's time to go back to the drawing board and see if you can round yourself out as a fighter. I understand that sentiment. I get it. I just wonder how effective Jarrett will be moving forward. How long is it going to take before he's ready for another elite level fighter out there, another elite level opponent? Because I'll tell you, the Jarrett Hurd I saw could use,
few fights,
1 or 2 more tune-ups before challenging anybody with a belt. Reiterate, I got the sense watching this fight that had Jarrett gone out there and pressured Francisco, he might have gotten him out of there sooner. That you saw the knockdown in the 12th. And this more or less denotes what I mean, that, if Jarrett Hurd went back to, fighting in the phone booth and establishing dominance there, perhaps this would have been a shorter night. But because he's working on things, because this is a deliberate attempt, it's hard to be critical, because I understand what's going on. It's just that he's looked better. I can't tell you what's going to happen with Jarrett moving forward. I can't. I can't tell you that I'm confident in this guy in what could be a, Jason Rosario fight or a Jermell Charlo fight. I can't tell you that. All I can tell you is this is what I think is going on, and I question how long it's going to take for Jarrett to round out as a fighter. It was a lackluster showing, yes, but that's why I think it was a lackluster showing. Now, in the case of Danny Garcia versus Ivan Redkach, I would say that also was a lackluster showing. It wasn't impressive. I expected more. But it is a little different with Danny because Danny's not experimenting with a new base style. He's not transitioning from being a boxer puncher to being a pressure fighter, or from being a pressure fighter to a pure boxer. Danny went out there and his performance was more or less consistent with what you come to expect of him. Good punches downstairs, good punches up top, some good hooks, great counter-punching. And yet Ivan Redkach was able to go the distance with Danny, where he wasn't able to go the distance with John Molina.
Nope.
And he wasn't able to go the distance with Dejan Zlaticanin.
Nope.
And these were fights that took place below the welterweight division. So you put him in there with Danny, and you tell yourself that, this guy's base style does Danny Garcia's base style a lot of favors, because Ivan Redkach's a very aggressive guy, he really likes to throw, and Danny's a good counterpuncher. But not only is Danny a good counterpuncher, he's got good strong punches, and he's got a chin. So you figure that Danny should be able to get this guy out of there, because Danny's got the upper hand in a lot of ways. He's got more experience as a welterweight. And you know what? Let's just be honest, folks. This was a showcase fight.
Yeah.
That's what it was supposed to be. It's supposed to be the kind of fight that accents Danny Garcia's finer qualities. The kind of fight that doesn't put him in any immediate danger. He's not in there with some top contender, some kind of killer. This is the kind of fight that's intended to preserve Danny up until such a time as he can have a bigger fight. Yet for some reason, Ivan goes the distance with Danny where he couldn't go the distance with John Molina at 140 pounds, or go the distance with Dejan Zlaticanin at 135 pounds. How do you explain it? What do you say?
Styles make fights.
I see people out there quoting the age-old cliche in boxing that styles make fights. And it is true. Styles do make fights. And in the realm of styles making fights, it was Danny Garcia that had the stylistic advantage because he's a counterpuncher. He can use the aggression of an aggressive guy like Ivan Redkach against him to hit him with punches that he doesn't see. Yet for some reason, this fight went to the cards. How do you wrap your mind around that? I'll tell you how you wrap your mind around it. It's not complicated, folks. Danny Garcia, underperformed.
That's all it is.
So don't start talking up Ivan Redkach to excuse Danny Garcia not being able to stop him. All Ivan Redkach's done in the welterweight division is beat a very past prime Devon Alexander, and that's it. That's all, folks. That's his body of work at 147. You ask me, if that were Ivan Redkach in there with Igus Kavaliauskas, for example, I don't think the fight would have went to the cards. If that were Ivan Redkach in there with Jose Benavidez, no, I still don't think the fight would have went to the cards. Whereas with Danny, it goes to the cards, and we have to try to wrap our minds around it. We have to try and understand why. And it's because Danny underperformed. This fight denoted the same issues that I think Danny Garcia has exhibited since he's arrived in the welterweight division, and it's that this guy doesn't hit the gas. He doesn't fight with a sense of urgency anymore. That killer instinct, that competitor's nature is missing from Danny Garcia. Maybe it's, this guy takes too many vacations, too many hiatuses, too much time away from the ring.
Too many hand-picked opponents.
I mean, if you're accustomed to having your pick of the litter more often than not, that effectively deprives you of that sense of danger, that urgency, to stay motivated and stay prepared for what other credible threats are out there should you one day find yourself with one in front of you. Well, when you're picking and choosing who you're going to fight more often than not, and you're not even fighting very often, because lest we forget, before Saturday, Danny had only one fight in 2019. One fight in the first quarter of the year in April against Adrian Granados.
That's all he did last year.
The rest of the year, he didn't fight nobody. He comes back in 2020, another hand-picked opponent.
Another one.
Except now he looks a lot more flat than he did when he fought Granados. So between constantly picking and choosing what opponent you feel suits you best and not fighting all that often, well, that makes for a flat performance like the one we saw this Saturday. There's no other way to describe it aside from a flat performance, that Danny Garcia looked flat. You expect more of this guy, and that's not what you got. It's not because he's experimenting with some new base style. It's not because the other guy has some stylistic advantage that gives Danny problems. Ivan Redkach is intended to be a walk in the park for a guy like Danny Garcia. For Christ's sakes, that's why they picked him.
Yeah.
I think the question becomes, if Danny Garcia can't put away this kind of an opponent, what chance does he really stand against Manny Pacquiao? I mean, I know that Errol Spence's name is in the hat as a potential opponent option for Danny, and I know that Danny called them both out simultaneously, both Errol Spence and Manny Pacquiao. But any way you slice it, what chance does he stand against those fighters when you can't even put away this fight?
What are you going to talk up Ivan Redkach now?
Did the bar of standards suddenly change in the welterweight division to where it's permissible to go the distance with the likes of an Ivan Redkach? I mean, could you imagine if that were Terrence Crawford that went 12 rounds with this guy and couldn't put him away? But we're supposed to pull punches because it's Danny Garcia, a guy who's been campaigning as a welterweight since 2014. I mean, he's been in the division for at least 4 to 5 years now. I'd have to say that he's acclimated by now.
Surely.
On one end, you got a guy like Terrence Crawford. Terrence Crawford, who's basically stopped every single opponent he's faced since arriving in the welterweight division. And these are all experienced welterweights, you understand. One end, you got a guy like Crawford, and on the other end, you got a guy like Danny, who's reached a point to where the likes of an Ivan Redkach can actually go the distance with him, can see the 12th round. And it's not based on the styles, because Ivan Redkach's style is tailor-made for Danny's style. An aggressive, come-forward guy against a counterpuncher. He's going to afford Danny all the opportunities he needs to finish him off. But Danny is lacking so much competitive drive that he doesn't even go for the kill anymore.
He don't go for the jugular.
I'm just wondering how much longer the PBC faction of the boxing community can keep up this charade, this facade, that one, this is the kind of matchmaking that boxing fans want to see, and two, that it doesn't reflect poorly on their stable of fighters, that they're sparsely active, constantly being upset by opponents they're supposed to be able to beat, and they're putting on these ho-hum showings like Danny Garcia's showing on Saturday night. There's no other way to explain it other than
He underperformed.
if Saturday night's fight did anything for Danny Garcia, it's likely that it does bring him closer to the Pacquiao fight, but it's bringing him closer to it for all the wrong reasons. The Pacquiao people have got to be looking at this guy like he's no threat to us. He can't even put away Ivan Redkach. The fuck's he gonna do with Manny? It seems to me that as the PBC stable of fighters attempts to preserve themselves for what are supposed to be bigger fights, they begin to come apart at the seams in the process of doing so. I mean, take Keith Thurman en route to what was to be the Pacquiao fight. Before that, he fought Josecito Lopez, and he didn't look good at all in that fight, did he? No, he languished en route to the Pacquiao fight. We see Danny, and Danny's area of expertise is supposed to be counterpunching, hitting guys with punches that they don't see, the kind of punches that normally take fighters out, yet he couldn't take out Ivan Redkach. You go a little lower. You assess Gervonta Davis's performance against Yuriorkis Gamboa in what was a fight that nobody thought would go 12 rounds, but it very much did. And while Yuriorkis Gamboa didn't see the end of it, he certainly saw the beginning, and that was a lot more than people expected. They expected that Gervonta Davis is going to go home early, and that's not what happened. What I'm describing here is a stable of fighters that have become so picky, so choosy, such big prima donnas, that they're not competitors anymore, and it's reverberating throughout several weight classes involving several of their fighters. Danny Garcia being the latest. There's no good reason for a guy like Ivan to go the distance with you unless you aren't what people say you are.
Yeah, that pretty much sums it up.